Welcome back to Baithak. I know it's been a long time since my last episode, and I really do apologize for that. It's been quite a tumultuous time in my life, and I was actually trying to figure out where exactly I was going with this podcast. I actually felt like I should be in a better position to be able to perform this duty that I feel that I am performing with this podcast. But I felt like instead of being in a position where I have all the knowledge and I'm being able to provide all this to you, why not take this journey together? The whole point of this podcast in the first place was to have a discussion where even I could learn things, even you could learn things, and all my loyal viewers could have a discussion with me, with each other, and then we could explore all these various topics. So I felt like it was quite stupid of me for a certain way to think that I may not be ready for this because, in a certain sense of the matter, throughout my life, I will never actually be in that position where I know everything and then I'll be able to sit in this position and dictate things. And that should not be something I should be focusing towards also. And I was actually having quite of a moral quandary in that sense, but I feel like I've gotten out of that. And this particular episode is actually quite special. One of my very good friends, Aryan Bai, actually reached out to me. He's been doing some wonderful work with DarjZine Youth Magazine, and he has recently started this new venture known as DarjZine. And of course, he's my namesake, so I actually have a soft spot for him in that sense as well. And he asked me to write a article for his new page. So I felt like, what should be the topic of this article? And while I was thinking about that, I felt, what is the most important thing that I want better to be known as? What is the most defining product, which you could say, the defining factors, so to speak? So I felt like the Indian Gorkha identity and the identity crisis that my community and our community faces is one of the most important things that I actually put out and I actually want to discuss on. So I've actually written a article on DarjZine. It's up there, and you can of course go and read the full article in its entirety on the DarjZine page, the link to which I will be linking down below. And the name of the article is "The Case for a Separate Gorkha or Indian Gorkha Identity." Now I will just want to have a discussion on this article as well, and just the various points that I go through. So let's get right into it. Of course, the article talks about the identity crisis of the Gorkha community, and this is something that I've always wanted to delve into deeper. We all have heard about the identity crisis that we are facing and how it is very important to us, especially during the Gorkhaland Revolution, how the Gorkhas are fighting for their identity and we are facing a massive identity crisis. But I just wanted to see what exactly it is and discuss it into a much more depth. I feel we don't really have a deep understanding of what exactly this identity crisis is. And I wanted to look at it from a more tactical perspective, a more theoretical perspective as well, and just see how it affects us and our lives. Now, if you go through the article, you'll see that I draw on the works of John Turner. He's quite an esteemed sociologist and a psychologist. And he basically posits this theory known as the social identity theory. It's quite an interesting theory, and I feel it helps us better understand this identity crisis. And it basically talks about two identities, and that is the personal identity and the group identity. It basically talks about how each and every individual has these two identities and how they are coexisting and kind of symbiotic in nature, where they codependent on each other. Basically, how it works is that we all have our own personal identities, but we also have group identities which are constantly affecting the personal identity, and the personal identity which is also affecting the group identity. Now, the four interesting ways in which the group identity affects the personal identity, firstly, is belonging. Now, it's quite easy to understand how, when you are in a group of people, like minded people, sharing common beliefs, sharing common experiences, how you would be in a much more comfortable position and how it will give you a sense of belonging. Now, this sense of belonging moves into working together and working together towards common goals, towards common achievements. And that brings us to the second point, which is purpose. It gives you a lot of purpose as well when you're in a group and you're working towards common achievements. Now, the third point draws on from purposes as well, where while you're working towards common achievements, it gives you a sense of self worth. It makes you feel like you're a part of something much bigger than yourself, and gives you a reason to wake up in the morning and actually do things and feel good about yourself. Now, all of these combine to form your identity. Basically, ever since you are born, you're basically working in groups. You're basically interacting with groups, be it your family, be it your friend circle, be it any other groups. And these groups essentially affect your identity. It affects your mannerisms, it affects your beliefs, it affects your basically working day to day. And that creates a very integral part of your personal identity. Now, there are other sub theories as well, which I feel we'll just go into a little bit to better understand the identity crisis. First is, of course, categorization. It's very easy to understand how the brain tends to categorize things. It's very difficult to understand each and every single thing as an individual. So basically, the brain tends to basically group these things together into categories. And it's the same with people as well. We meet tens of thousands of people throughout our entire lives, and it's very difficult to understand them and identify them on an individual basis. So our brain generally tends to group them together as. So this psychological factor bleeds into the social behavior as well, where we as humans tend to form groups and basically work together in groups. The second part is identification, which I feel is much more interesting and it's much more relatable to our identity crisis as well. And identification basically means how you enter these groups, how an individual enters these groups. Now, how it works is there's two methods of how you can actually identify or enter a group. It's passive and active. Passive basically means that you're born into it, you don't really have much of a choice into it, be that and some examples of that could be your family or your nationality. And an active introduction or an active identification is much more interesting because an interesting phenomenon takes place, which is coined by John Turner as social influence. Basically, what happens is when you're trying to identify yourself with a group, you imbibe and imitate a lot of the mannerisms, a lot of the behaviors, and a lot of the beliefs of the group. And this is the crux of the social identity theory. Basically, how individuals morph themselves to form groups and how the group itself morphs itself based on the on the individuals which are a member of it. Now, there is a certain social hierarchy in place as well, where the senior members of the group are looked towards as role models, and basically they form a more leadership role in the group where they dictate where the group is going to move towards, what achievements they're going to follow, and basically they also create the identity of the group which the other members actually imbibe. So I feel that is also quite a big responsibility. The third is not that relevant to our topic, but basically what you need to understand is comparison. How in groups, how you tend to compare your group with other groups and you form this some sort of competition, because obviously if you're trying to achieve something, you're trying to achieve that against someone, and this kind of forms a comparison. But all you need to understand is this sense of competition actually brings forward a sense of group pride as well, which really helps towards the purpose and self-worth aspects of how the group identity affects the personal identity. And the fourth point is positive distinctiveness as well, where basically when you feel like you're part of a group, it gives you a sense of distinctiveness. It gives you a sense of, yes, I'm different and I'm not just a run-of-the-mill person. It gives you a sense of pride as well, where it makes you feel like, yes, I am so and so, and it forms a very deep part of your identity as well, where of course I believe you've seen this happening, where the sports club that you are a fan of becomes a major integral part of your personal identity. And similarly, this creates a lot of distinctiveness as well. And the last point, which I feel is the most important point, especially for our discussion today, is mobility. Now, when a group does not necessarily fulfill these criteria for you or fulfill these needs for you, you tend to move away from the group and you tend to basically leave that group in search of a group which is actually fulfilling that for you. Now, this can happen for a myriad of reasons, most common of which is when the group does not really have a distinct border or a distinct understanding or basically a distinct definition. If the group is not essentially exclusive, or you don't really know what the group is, where the group's definition is quite vague, then it becomes very difficult to identify with that group. And that actually creates a sense of issue, because you want to feel belonged, you want to derive purpose from that group. But when you don't really know what the purpose of that group is, or what even the group is, it becomes very difficult to actually create these from the group. So obviously, as people who need that, we tend to move towards other groups. And of course, when the group itself is not succeeding, when it's failing, when it's not essentially achieving its goals, then also we tend to move away from the group and essentially move towards other groups, or towards an individual sense as well, where we don't want to be a part of group and we just want to work on individual matters. Now, all of these points, I believe, are ringing bells, and I believe we can really associate with the identity crisis that we've been facing in the Gorkha community. First and foremost, of course, the issue of, this is something I'm very passionate about, and this is something I've talked about in a lot in the past as well, is of how we as a community don't really have a proper definition. We as a community don't really have a proper understanding of what our group essentially is. And a big part of that comes from the name itself. Now, I personally like to call our community the Indian Gorkha community, but that's not exactly the official name, because we essentially don't have an official name. Now, there are a myriad of names that we call ourselves, and I would just like to go through them and see, and basically discuss about how each and every name is causing issues. The first and foremost is, of course, Nepali. Now, of course, we are Nepalis, and there's nothing to argue against that, but you can see how it creates confusion, because there is a complete other country which is known as Nepal, and the members of that country call themselves Nepali. Now, we as Indians, it becomes very difficult to identify with another country, although our history is intricately tied with Nepal, but at the same time, we have created an individual and separate identity as well. So, in a lot of sense, it becomes very difficult to identify with Nepal as well, because they have their own issues. They're a completely separate country. They're going through a separate issues, so much so that our histories have become so divided that we no longer even seem to relate with some of the issues that they face. And it becomes very difficult to identify with that community. So much so that I talked about this in few previous episodes as well, where our language has also moved, and our language has become much different. Not to the point where it's not mutually understandable, but there are a lot of changes. So Nepali creates an issue, and it creates an issue with our identity as well, because when we move towards India and when we move around India, and when other communities are trying to interact with us, and because of course, because of social categorization, other Indians also tend to, because at the end of the day they are humans, so they tend to group people, so they don't really know where to place us, whether we are immigrants from Nepal, whether we are Indians, whether we are Bengalis even, because the main portion of Darjeeling lies in Bengal. So even for them, it becomes an issue. And so the very word Nepali creates a lot of confusion. The next is, of course, hill people, or we like to call ourselves as Pahares. Now that also, you can see how that can also cause issues. And as someone who personally lives in Delhi, the communities of Himachal and Uttarakhand, they also like to call themselves Paharis. And so it becomes very confusing with them as well. So you can see how that can also cause a lot of issues. And I feel Gorkha itself is the most close we can get to a proper definition of what we are. But once you add the Indian tag towards it, where you call our community the Indian Gorkha community, then that becomes, I feel, a much more defined border, a much more defined existence, essentially, where we can properly distinct ourselves and define ourselves away from Nepal, but as the community. Basically, the people who are from a Gorkha descent but essentially live in India and are Indian citizens. But there are a lot of issues with that as well, which I talk in the article. The very word Gorkha itself has a lot of connotations, and that also becomes problematic in the future. But I feel at this point, the best definition and the best name we have is the Indian Gorkha community. Now, the second part of that is, of course, a name goes a long way in defining those borders. But there are a lot of other factors as well. There are essentially defining factors of a group which help it coalesce and which help it imbibe together and basically help its members identify with the group. Now, there are a lot of lacking factors, and I have talked about this in previous episodes as well, where the Indian Gorkha community is so outstretched, and we have members in the Northeast as well, we have members in the Darjeeling, Sikkim area as well, we have members in Uttarakhand as well, we have members in all the major cities, we have members in Goa itself, we have members in Dehradun as well. So it becomes very difficult for all these communities to have shared factors, shared defining factors. Now, people from Darjeeling will tend to have more characteristics of people who live in the cold areas. People in the Northeast will have a much more behaviors and beliefs which are in tune with the Northeast communities of that area. People who live in Dehradun and Goa and these areas will have a much more mix of the Indian culture as well. So it becomes very difficult to find defining factors. But I did go through a few, and we do actually have a lot of defining factors which we could delve into deeper and work towards, so we can create that sense of group identity within ourselves. A few that I've recently talked about was, of course, bravery in war and a history of war. Almost, I believe, every single Indian Gorkha family has people who were in the army, who have fought in wars, and war has always been an integral part of our community. Others is, of course, we are very prolific in music and art. We've always known to be a very creative bunch. In the past as well, we had a lot of literary minds, we had a lot of musical minds as well. So of course these factors can be further delved into and further essentially created, and these can be the defining glue which can keep our community together. Now, besides that, and besides the defining factors, there are other things as well which keep the group together. Now, if we could move from this hurdle and we could actually create an identity, a well-defined identity which we can identify towards, then we would actually need people to identify with the group as well. Because as we talked about, there has been a lot of individual mobility which happened within the Gorkha community. And I think this is something that we need to sit down and understand. And that this is a fact that the generations today, especially my generation, don't really have a lot of reasons to identify with our group. Our group, the Gorkha community, through its various failures, through its ambiguous and quite undefined nature, has created a group which is not very well defined and it's not a very inviting group, so to say. Because as we spoke about, a group needs to give a sense of belonging, a group needs to give a sense of purpose, a group needs to give a sense of self-worth. And I believe the Indian Gorkha community currently does not really check those boxes. And in order to do that, I feel the best way we can do that is move into our history and move into the cultural aspects, because that is what defines especially a cultural or ethnic group. The culture, the cultural aspects, the traditions, the religion, the religious aspects, I'm sorry, and the basically the historical aspects as well. Various heroes, various role models. And I know that there are a lot of role models. We have a lot of cultural aspects. We have a lot, and we have a very rich history, but it's not very well explored. And it's not very well divided as well, because of course, our history, if we go back in our history, it intermingles with Nepal's history a lot. But I feel that we need to create a separate history as well as a separate cultural aspect as well. Because there are a lot of things which only Indian Gorkhas do, which Nepal people don't do, people from Nepal don't do. And there's a lot of historical aspects as well, which are exclusive essentially to Indian Gorkhas. And so, if we can create a well studied, well demarcated historical and cultural aspect to the Indian Gorkha community, then we can really tap into that essentially that allure of the group where the members of the group actually want to coalesce and want to actually be members of the group. Now, once this is achieved, wonderful things will happen because the social identity theory states that once the group identity is strong, once the group belonging is strong, a sense of strong empathy is created. Then what happens is every single person is working towards the betterment of the group. Every single person wants the group to form achievements, to achieve goals, basically to basically be better economically, culturally, historically. And once that is done, then I feel that is only when we can have proper progress. Now, if we take a step back and try to see why exactly did we have the Gorkhaland agitation? Because we wanted our community to become better, right? We wanted growth for our community. We wanted development for our community. And we felt that the separate state was the answer. But what I say is Gorkhaland is not the state. Gorkhaland is actually a community where we are proud to be members of it and we actively work towards bettering it. And if that cannot be achieved, then there's nothing a state can do that can develop our community. First, we need to act. We need to better our community. And to better our community, we actually need to want to identify with our community. And to want to identify with our community, we need to create the separate Gorkha identity. And this is actually the crux of the article that I talked about. If you want to read further, the article is linked down below. And that is it that I want to say for this right now. Of course, I'll be discussing this further in further episodes. And I thank you all for listening. I thank you all for watching. And I thank you all for being patient for this episode as well. Godspeed to you all.